What if everything economists believe about profit is a lie? Marx thought so, and in Theories of Surplus Value, the massive unfinished work sometimes called Volume 4 of Kapital, he exposes economics as a system of excuses for exploitation. As Marx opens, open quote, all economists share the error of examining surplus value not as such, but in its particular form of profit and rent, end quote. This book isn't just theory, it's a war on ideology. It's Marx tearing through 200 years of economic thought to show that profit, rent, and interest are all just disguises for one thing: unpaid labour. Before Marx, thinkers like Sir James Stewart believed that profit came from clever trading. Buy cheap, sell dear. Marx mocks this as an illusion. Open quote, Stewart did not get beyond this restricted view, though he reproduced it in scientific form, end quote. Profit can't come from exchange. Someone's loss is another's gain. The total remains the same. The secret must lie inside production itself. That's where the physiocrats enter, led by Francois Quenzi in 18th century France. They were the first to look at production as the source of wealth, but they made one mistake. They thought only agriculture produced surplus value. Marx credits them for their insight, but says, open quote, they explained surplus value by the fertility of the soil, end quote. They mistook nature for the source of value. Marx corrects them. It isn't nature, it's human labour, measured by time, that creates value. Then comes Adam Smith, who recognises this, open quote, general social labour creates value. Surplus value is nothing but a part of this labour, appropriated by the owners of the material conditions of labour, end quote. But Smith too retreats from his own discovery. He begins to confuse surplus value with profit, as if profit is a natural reward to capital. Marx writes with frustration, open quote, he is upsetting the law of origin of surplus value, which he has just established, end quote. And that's how capitalism hides exploitation, by renaming unpaid labour as profit. Part 2 moves deeper into David Ricardo, Malthus, James Mill, and the economists who built on Smith. Ricardo tried to formalize value scientifically, and for Marx, he came closer than anyone to the truth. Ricardo saw that commodities exchange according to the quantity of labour that they contain. But even Ricardo stumbled when he met the contradictions of capitalism. He couldn't explain how the rate of profit equalizes across industries, why capitalists get similar returns even when different sectors use different amounts of labour. He saw the contradiction, but he couldn't solve it without abandoning the labour theory itself. Marx writes with sympathy but precision, open quote, Ricardo is concerned only with the magnitude of surplus value. He has not yet developed the distinction between constant and variable capital, end quote. And this is the key. Only variable capital, which is the part spent on labour power, creates new value. Machines, which are constant capital, transfer their value, but they don't add to it. Then comes those that Marx calls the vulgar economists, men like Malthus, who tried to defend rent and profit as natural. Malthus claimed that landlords perform, open quote, necessary social function, end quote. Marx replied sharply, open quote, the landlord's right to rent is no more eternal than the slaveholder's right to the labour of his slave, end quote. For Marx, this is the turning point, when political economy stops explaining capitalism and starts justifying it. Economists after Ricardo began to treat profit, interest, and rent as independent sources of value, three magical fountains of wealth. Marx shatters this illusion. He shows they're just different ways of dividing the same surplus value extracted from workers. Open quote, profit is only a transformed form of surplus value, just as interest and rent are merely derivative forms of this same surplus value, end quote. In simple terms, the capitalist, the banker, and the landlord don't create new wealth. They share the spoils of exploitation. Marx writes with venom, open quote, "The entire mystery of the capitalist mode of production lies in this separation, the transformation of surplus labour into profit, interest, and rent," end quote. This section of the book, perhaps more than any other, bridges Kapital Volume 1 and Volume 3. It's Marx mapping the bloodstream of exploitation, tracing how the same surplus labour pumps profit into every corner of the system. By the time Marx reaches part 3 of this book, economics itself has entered decay. He calls this the age of, open quote, vulgar economics, end quote. Here, the science that once tried to uncover value turns into a mouthpiece for the rich. Economists no longer ask where profit comes from. They just start from the assumption that capital naturally earns it. Marx's tone becomes biting, open quote. Vulgar economics is nothing but an attempt to interpret, systematize, and apologize for the existing relations of production, end quote. Instead of questioning the system, they dress up exploitation as harmony. Profit becomes, open quote, the return to enterprise, end quote. Interest becomes, open quote, the reward for saving, end quote. And rent becomes, open quote, the gift of nature, end quote. Marx sees this not just as intellectual decline, but ideological corruption, open quote. In its bourgeois form, political economy becomes the science of the ruling class, end quote. By the end, the great insights of Smith and Ricardo are buried under the comforting myths of competition, efficiency, and individual merit, myths that still dominate our textbooks today. Marx closes the work on a note of defiance. Real science, he insists, must return to the foundation that capitalism hides, the social relations of production, not the market's illusions. Open quote, the true science of modern society begins only when the economist stops taking the appearances of competition for reality, end quote. In other words, real political economy must start where bourgeois economics stops, at the question of labour and power. Across 3 parts and over 700 pages, Theories of Surplus Value charts a revolution in thought. From exchange to production, from appearance to essence, from profit to exploitation. It's Marx's demolition of every illusion that protects capitalism. Open quote, surplus value is nothing but a part of this labour, appropriated by the owners of the material conditions of labour, end quote. In that one sentence lies the truth he spent his entire life proving, that profit is unpaid labour, dressed up as virtue. And that's why Theories of Surplus Value isn't just the missing volume 4. It's the intellectual battlefield where Marx defeats the entire tradition of bourgeois economics. Thank you again. You've been watching The Left Library, the home of simple political theory. If this helped you to see how Marx dismantled the idea of profit, hit subscribe and maybe even share this video to some of your friends, because understanding exploitation is the first step towards ending it.